I warmly welcome you to the introduction to this series, focusing on the most powerful armed forces on the planet. Probably most of you will wonder why we chose to include an introduction to this series. First of all, to understand how complicated this topic is, we invite you to reflect on the modern nature of wars. Wars no longer break out. The blatant manifestation of the war with losers and winners has been replaced by the war without restrictions, a war that employs every means: media, finance, mercenaries, psychological warfare, the use of every political, economic, social and military resource. In this series, we consider the war and the tools involved in the most classical perspective, the conventional one. In order to set this overview in a scientific perspective, we will explain why this series, despite being the product of a passionate effort that required a frightening number of hours of work, including research, graphics, recording, editing, composing, cannot be considered in any way complete, and why it is innately difficult to answer the question which countries have the most powerful armed forces in the world without falling into the temptation to simplify. Afterwards, I will briefly explain why we have adopted a tier system instead of the classic top 10. Finally, I will quickly review the nations included in the various tiers, explaining why for each of them we have focused on specific aspects instead of adopting a standard that is the same for all. However, during the videos in this series, it will be shown for each country a detailed list regarding number and type of weapons. First and foremost, let's establish a fundamental point. There is no truly reliable way to rank militaries, really. There is such a huge number of factors, some of which are impossible to evaluate, qualitatively and quantitatively, or even to be known if not in the event of war. Troop training, morale, leadership, logistic efficiency, ammunition reserve, national support and motivation, diplomatic and geostrategic environment, war readiness, and real situation of the equipments. Real impact of technologies, strategies and doctrines, a famous example being German tank doctrine, organization and tactics during the Second World War. Again, the impact of surprise and execution of eventual surprise attacks, and so on. Once it has been made clear that it is impossible to evaluate all the factors that determine the military potential of a nation, it is easier to understand the choice to adopt a tier-based ranking system instead of one based on a top 10. In this regard, our suggestion is to imagine that the nations belonging to a tier are united by having armed forces with similar capabilities, ambitions and objectives. Therefore, for example, it is possible to suppose that the armed forces of a tier 3 nation could hardly win a hypothetical offensive war against a nation belonging to tier 2. While, on the contrary, still be able to set up a competent defense against an offensive coming from a tier 2 nation. In addition, in a top 10, people can claim that a certain nation is stronger than another one. The same is simply not possible in a tier-based ranking, if not by just stating the obvious. In a 1 versus 1 scenario, nations which belongs to tier 2 are significantly stronger than those of tier 3. In an all-out war, there is not a reasonable chance that a tier 3 nation can beat a tier 2 one. Equally, a tier 1 nation will destroy a tier 2 one. Please consider that these are only hypothetical scenarios, read impossible, because the mutual devastation involved is immense, especially if you consider the use of thermonuclear, chemical and biological weapons. So, which countries are in this list? Before we begin, we specified that the following part is a big spoiler, an extreme summary of the whole series. Therefore, some of you might find it pleasant to listen to this part after watching the videos in this series. For those wishing to anticipate the surprise instead, this part can definitely give you a key, an introduction to better understand and appreciate the content of the videos. The choice is yours. We made our evaluations, and the task was not easy. While there are obvious candidates, the decision suddenly became complicated when it came to deciding which nations to include in tier 3. The United Kingdom and France were the first to enter this tier. Both nuclear and economic powers, with an adequate industrial infrastructure and a first-rate defense industry, The armed forces of these countries have been downsized following the defense cuts suffered since the end of the Cold War and the progressive reduction of their respective spheres of influence due to the process of decolonization, although especially France still tries to maintain its influence in a significant part of its former colonial domains, the France-Afrique. They are similar in size and power, but they possess different capabilities. Our analysis of the armed forces of the United Kingdom inevitably begins with Her Majesty's soldiers. Although in fact the numbers are quite low, they are among the most experienced armed forces in the world, having fought in large numbers in Afghanistan and Iraq. In this regard, it should be noted that they are among the very few nations in the world with a recent experience coordinating large-scale operations of division size. There follows a very quick analysis of the equipment, focusing more the attention on the most important changes and acquisitions, such as the recent 2 aircraft carriers of the new Queen Elizabeth class. The part relating to the French armed forces has been designed instead for the many we met during our research, curious to know between the French and British armed forces which one of these is the strongest, or simply fans for one or the other. We did not focus, as for the United Kingdom, on French soldiers because it is difficult to make a breakdown of the French missions in West Africa, since it is recent and still present, unlike the main part of the British intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq. What is certain is that the French didn't have the opportunity to conduct large-scale operations, such as those carried by the British, so unlike the latter, they lack this precious operative experience. Therefore, we have adopted a comparative approach, especially in relation to the British armed forces. The analysis of the equipment takes into account the greater importance of the French nuclear deterrence force, La Force de Frappe, the third largest atomic arsenal in the world, some interesting designs produced by the French defense industry, and the projection capabilities given by its nuclear aircraft carrier, Charles de Gaulle. Japan enters Tier 3 as the most unbalanced of the armed forces we have dealt with. Even with a modern, well-trained and equipped army and aviation, the latter are far less significant than the far more powerful navy. In fact, even if it doesn't possess a nuclear component, Japan has a fleet whose projection capability is second only to that of the United States, with 4 aircraft carriers accompanied by as many battle groups. Another very important part of the review on the Japanese armed forces is the humorous tone with which we underline the ambiguities of these armed forces in carrying the name of self-defense forces or in adopting names that sound harmless, especially for the units capable of expressing a more markedly offensive potential, such as the aircraft carriers. We do not support nor we intend to outrage anyone. We simply believe that one of the aims of journalism should be to shed light on unclear things, to unveil ambiguities, and to help who watches to better understand the reality. It is important to understand these ambiguities because Japan could use tensions with China and North Korea to abolish Article 9 of the Constitution that prevents Japan from acquiring offensive capabilities and armaments and make Japan great again. That of South Korea is a weird story. On the web, there are few references to the military power of this country, something really impressive considering its capabilities. South Korea has been able to create from just nothing in a few decades one of the most advanced defense industries in the world. Only China has been able to do better. Today, South Korea is able to produce what we believe to be actually the most powerful tank in the world. Improvements to hold US armored fighting vehicles, state-of-the-art naval units, and much more. In some ways very similar to South Korea is Turkey. Despite not having the economic foundations of South Korea, Turkey has been able to exploit its alliance with NATO and its very important strategic position on the map to receive US armaments, financing and aid, succeeding thanks also to offset deals signed with important US defense companies in creating a national defense industry. The review of the Turkish armed forces therefore focuses on this development path. In Tier 2 we find very powerful countries. The characteristic of these countries, however, is that of not being able to project all the weight of their power. In this regard, we are sorry to sound arrogant, but we truly believe that there is no better definition than regional superpowers. India is one of these. Gigantic numbers of soldiers and equipment, but has a big problem: the absence of a solid defense industry, and a country cannot win an intensive modern war without it. India has started to face this problem, so we will see in the future if Indians will be able to succeed in this intent. We have talked about the very difficult geostrategic context this country lives in, its fears and the challenges to overcome. We also talk about Indian armed forces strengths, among which, for example, the very advanced missile capabilities, the modern advanced ships designs, or the fifth generation fighters project. Russia is the country of records regarding what is known about its armed forces. There is not a single country for which it is possible, at the same time, to overestimate and underestimate its armed forces with such a large margin of error. This is mainly the result of convergent efforts. In fact, while the United States Department of Defense needs to justify a constantly increasing budget, Russia needs to look like the reborn superpower in advance of the unquestionable and improved capabilities possessed. For this reason, the video about the Russian armed forces tries to shed light on its real capabilities and ambitions, focusing in particular on the very advanced defense capabilities where Russia is the number one: anti-air defense systems. China is the country with the most impressive growth and development rates. China's military progress is, to say the least, surprising. In the review of its armed forces, we started by considering the challenge with the United States and the recent announcements on the radical changes in the structure of the armed forces. Needless to say, we are focused on the recent products of this fast technological progress, especially the new naval units and the new fifth generation fighter, the Chengdu J-20. While we haven't investigated developments in space technology to avoid further lengthening a video that was already too long. Finally, the only Tier 1 country, United States. The United States is the only country currently capable to project much of its military power to any point of the globe, at any time and at short notice. The video about the US military is completely different from the others. In fact, although the US armed forces excel in almost every area, in recent years they are facing a changed geopolitical scenario. From the absolute dominance since the end of the Cold War to a multipolar world in which they must share the globe with China and Russia, waiting for other emerging countries to claim their share. As such, we have focused primarily on two aspects: what makes the US military so powerful that it can be included alone into Tier 1, and the threats and asymmetric challenges that US forces are facing. Please support us if you like the content, subscribe and feel free to share the love on your favorite social networks or through our Patreon account. And please forgive us for the not perfect pronunciation and errors. We are not native English speakers. The same applies to the quality of the graphics and sound, which certainly doesn't match the quality of the content. You can be sure that we will improve this aspect as the channel grows and that we intend to create content of the highest quality possible. We are waiting for your opinions.